Our commentary today, entitled Can We Handle the Truth?, will be presented by Reverend Patricia A. Walton. Reverend Walton holds a Master's of Divinity from Andover Newton Theological School, Newton, Massachusetts, and was ordained May 2001. She served as the assistant to Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life and Protestant Chaplain, Wellesley College, Wellesley, Massachusetts. Reverend Walton is currently a member of Bloom in the Desert. She is married to Homer Walton, and they celebrated their 59th anniversary on March 27th this year. They have 2 children, Aaron Walton and Valerie Walton, 1 grandson, Jacob Walton, and 1 son-in-law, Andrew Krause, married to Aaron. Reverend Walton's joy comes from love of family and being an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ.
I am a woman called to speak with wisdom, shining a light that will lead, oh God, to you. Lord, give me courage to be your witness. Make me a woman of your truth. Good morning, church. As you may have concluded from our call to worship, to reach the 19th Amendment was a long, complicated, hard-fought battle that, thanks to the suffragist movement, the culture of America was changed. However, I hope another brief sentence spoken in the call to worship gave you pause. That particular sentence is, although for our Black and brown sisters, that right did not come true until 1965. In reality, it was due to that ever-present history of racism that sentence was necessary. As we are celebrating an important aspect of American history, we cannot overlook the trials and tribulations of all involved. Church, this might surprise you, but this has been one of the most painful sermons I've been asked to preach. As I began researching information for today's celebration, I was surprised by the ugly truth of racism that was a constant even then. It was so devastatingly severe, yet accepted by many of the citizens at that time when the suffragists were organizing. I even asked myself if those who presented my name as a potential preacher for today had any idea of the racism intertwined in the movement. The more I read, the more I questioned myself whether I should simply tell today's planners to seek someone else to deliver today's message. But here I am. And I've entitled today's sermon, Can We Handle the Truth? And church, notice I said, can we, not just can you, but can we handle the truth? Now, the beginning of the movement appeared to be racially inclusive. Equality was a mutual motivation that stimulated action. African Americans, both female and male, believed being able to vote would alleviate the prejudice and discrimination they were experiencing in their lives. Likewise, white women believed that being able to vote would alleviate the prejudice and the discrimination they were experiencing in their lives. So they joined forces. I was impressed with the courage and determination of Susan B. Anthony and other suffragettes like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In 1856, Susan B. Anthony became an agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society, encountering sometimes violent opposition. Did you know, church, that some of the suffragist protesters were even imprisoned and force-fed when staging hunger strikes while imprisoned? Susan B. Anthony dealt with angry mobs and armed threats. Objects were thrown at her. She was hung in effigy, and her image was dragged through the streets. Nevertheless, at first, aspiringly, Anthony and Stanton increasingly tied female suffrage and Black suffrage together, forming the Women's National Loyal League. In 1863, to support the 13th Amendment, to abolish slavery, and were campaigning for full citizenship for Blacks and women. But over time, the suffragist groups divided along racial lines because the Black suffragettes believing achieving the vote for Black women and Black men was a crucial issue for voting rights movement. However, the 15th Amendment of 1870, which gave the vote to Black men, angered, infuriated many of the white suffragists who believed achieving the vote for white women was the most important issue, and that white women must get the vote before Black men. Oh, yes. Unfortunately, in reality, women's suffragist movement was burdened with an infestation of racism by some of its members. Even Stanton's inner racism was exposed when she said Black women would find an even worse slavery under Black men than they did under their former white slave owner. At conventions in 1901 and 1903 in Atlanta and New Orleans, white suffragists of the National American Suffrage Association prevented African Americans from attending. According to another Wikipedia article, tensions between African American and white suffragists persisted. By the early 1900s, white suffragists often adopted strategies designed to appease the Southern states at the expense of African American women. By 1913, racism was tightly stitched into the fabric of the movement for women's votes. As far back as the 1860s, suffrage leaders had traded in anti-Black thinking. They had even linked arms with openly racist allies. For example, in 1867, Kansas looked to trade the defeat of Black enfranchisement for the elevation of white women to the polls. The movement continued into the 20th century by way of a Southern strategy that aimed to win support for a woman's suffrage amendment by remaining hands-off when it came to Jim Crow, assenting to the ongoing disenfranchisement of Black women in the South. Even suffragette Alice Paul, who is honored in many ways, she built her radical wing of the movement on this troubled foundation. In 1913, the National Woman's Party failed African American women most visibly by refusing to allow them to march in the nation's first suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. Ida B. Wells, founder of the Alpha Suffrage Club, for African American women, the first suffrage club for Black women in Illinois. And they set out to join Alice Paul's National Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. But under fear of how the white community in D.C. would receive them, Paul did not exclude Wells and her marchers, but also did not welcome them. The Black women were asked to march in the back of the parade. But Wells defiantly persisted and moved up to march alongside the white women in the Illinois delegation. And there were many other African American suffragists who were discriminated against by some of the white suffragists, even through the movement for equality. Basically, even though the movement for equality was begun by the efforts of the African American women, for example, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Mary Church Terrell. I learned as I delved deeper into the organization of the movement, coalitions were emerging between the Northern and Southern suffragettes because they felt in order to reach the numbers they needed to accomplish the goals of voting rights for white women, the movement would benefit from a joint compromise, a compromise between them. And such a compromise was proposed as a way to expand the movement. Eventually, that proposed compromise between the Northern integrationists and the white Southern segregationist suffragettes who believed strongly in the bigoted anti-Black states' rights. That proposed compromise was agreed upon. And remember this now, church, to do so required ignoring and turning a blind eye to the cultural practices like lynchings and other racist attitudes that were commonplace in those Southern states, which the Southern suffragists supported. Nevertheless, that reality didn't deter the decision to compromise. Church, this was an era when the lynchings of Blacks were rampant and viewed by some as an acceptable necessity for keeping Blacks in their place. Those lynchings continued well into the 20th century. And yes, there were those who not only chose to ignore the horror of such happenings, even worse, they delighted in the spectacle. One such lynching that took place in 1918 was of the African American 8-month pregnant Mary Turner, lynched by an angry mob because she dared to publicly protest the lynching and murder of her husband, who himself had been falsely accused of murder. Mary Turner was tied and hung upside down by the ankles, her clothes soaked with gasoline and set on fire and burned from her body. Her belly was split open with a knife like those used in splitting hogs. Her unborn baby fell to the ground and gave 2 feeble cries. Its head was crushed by a member of the mob with his heel. And the crowd shot hundreds of bullets into Turner's body. This description of that lynching rocked me to the core. It shattered my irresponsible, insensitive acceptance that compromise in all instances is an acceptable tactic to reach one's goal. Like I said before, and I believe it's worth repeating, compromising required ignoring and turning a blind eye to the cultural practices like lynchings and other racist attitudes that were commonplace in those southern states, which were supported by the southern suffragettes. A reality that didn't deter the decision for a compromise. So the 19th Amendment was finally passed in 1920, but as we read in our call to worship, it wasn't until the 1965 Voting Rights Act that disenfranchised African Americans were able to vote unencumbered, at least for a while. And here we go again. As recently as 2013, the Supreme Court's decision gutted the critical voter protections within the 1965 Voting Rights Act, crippling the federal government's ability to prevent discriminatory changes to state voting laws and procedures. Well, there's so much more history our country needs to acknowledge, but time doesn't permit a full history lesson. By now, you may be asking, so what does history have to do with Jesus? What's the point or purpose of going over history? My answer to those questions is a reminder that every Sunday, when we hear our scriptures read, we are going over history. And it is the hope that remembering our biblical history will make us aware that no matter the era, with all humility, we can be awakened to the spiritual call within. That we too are persons who can better apply the teachings of Jesus. And dare I say that lynchings and the crucifixion of Jesus share much in common when you think of the pain and torture endured. And please hear this, Jesus didn't compromise righteousness for expediency. Questions. Do the ends justify the means? Is compromising righteousness to get what you want morally acceptable? Answers. Ignoring racism doesn't eliminate racism. Compromise is seldom the answer to bring about true justice. In the Bible, both the First Testament and the Second Testament name women who were leaders and seekers of justice, women who recognized and experienced the bias and inequality of cultural expectations assigned to them. And these women were encouraged to change the status quo. Do you remember the Hebrew passage? What courage it must have taken for the daughters of Zelophehad to stand at the door of the tent of meeting and go before Moses, the priests, the leaders, and all the congregation, seeking justice and challenging the cultural expectations of their day. Like Martha in today's gospel, have we accepted the cultural expectations of our society and been too busy to listen to Jesus's teachings? In an earlier chapter in Luke, we are told about the experience Jesus went through at the beginning of his ministry, a test, if you will, of his soul. He was being presented with the easiest, self-serving way he could accomplish his earthly purpose. But church, he resisted the temptation of that evil enticement and instead chose the hard way, the righteous way. On the Sabbath in a synagogue, he read a passage from Isaiah and identified with it. We learned the words in Isaiah passage in Luke, verse 18, chapter 4. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. Church, Jesus didn't offer compromise. Jesus didn't go along to get along. Jesus didn't say, set the oppressed free when it is convenient or when it will benefit my life or ease my conscience. Jesus didn't ignore or downplay evil in order to gain more followers to his cause, nor did he join them. He didn't do what was culturally expected. Instead, he was preaching and teaching righteousness and justice, such righteousness and justice that is formed by God's love. Perhaps these were the teachings of Jesus that Mary was listening to, but words Martha was too busy to hear or internalize. Martha was serving the dictates and expectations of their culture. Jesus proclaimed the recovery of sight for the blind. We mustn't turn a blind eye to the new way people are being disenfranchised. But that may require unlearning those subliminal messages of white male superiority inherited from years ago. That was then. This is now. Suffragettes of today, we can make a difference in our world. Action is needed. Forget not, church, the critical voter protections that were gutted with the Voting Rights Act of 2013. Forget not the slow gutting of the United States Post Office. Action is needed. Jesus was encouraging Mary to follow the dictates of her spirit, her soul. Mary need not be chained to what others thought she should do. She was breaking the chains of being imprisoned by relegated, stay in your place cultural standards. She was listening to Jesus and hearing what she felt within her very essence, that by following the lessons of Jesus, she was also serving him. But what about Martha? Was Martha able to change? The passage seems to have been intended to teach us the importance of making Jesus our highest priority. But church, what about Martha? Was she too set in her ways? Was she simply doing what the culturally expected mandate of her? Was she afraid to change? She was working hard to be hospitable, but to what purpose? Surely Jesus wanted more for her and more from her. It has been 100 years since the 19th Amendment made it possible for some women to vote. But for what purpose? Will our votes be guided by Jesus's teachings to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free? Once again, we are being called to make history, righteous history. We are still being called to correct the history of injustice, bigotry, racism, sexism, and alas, once again, to end voter suppression. Can we hear the call? Can we answer the call? We are people called to be God's servants. bound by the grace that God's love imparts. Lord, make us humble. Teach us to follow you. Make us a people of your heart. All are being invited like Mary and encouraged like Martha to listen and to follow without compromise or excuse. To listen and to follow the loving, righteous teachings of Jesus.